the 7 nations covered by Trump executive order by John Hayward. In truth, the ban applies to everyone from 7 specific countries. In fact, one of the first families caught at the airport when the executive order went into effect was a Christian family from Syria. These 7 nations were not chosen at random. They were all singled out as exceptional security risks in the Terrorist Prevention Act of 2015 and its 2016 extension. In fact, President Trump's order does not even name the 7 countries. It merely refers to the sections of U.S. code that were changed by the Terrorist Prevention Act. I hereby proclaim that the immigrant and non-immigrant entry into the United States of aliens from countries referred to in Section 217A12 of the INA, 8 U.S.C. 1187A12, would be detrimental to the interests of the United States, and I hereby suspend entry into the United States, as immigrants and non-immigrants, of such persons for 90 days from the date of this order. A different section of the executive order does refer to Syria specifically, because it calls for the indefinite suspension of Syrian refugee admissions, until such time as the President believes security concerns have been adequately addressed. The list of 7 nations affected by Trump's executive order was, therefore, compiled by President Barack Obama's Department of Homeland Security, in a series of judgments that actually goes back to Obama's first term, circa 2011. Barack Obama made this list, not Donald Trump, and there was very little resistance from congressional Democrats at any step in the process of arriving at the final list of Iraq, Iran, Syria, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen. Nor should there have been congressional resistance, because that list is eminently sensible. Several of these countries are disasters because of Obama foreign policy, while others were security nightmares long before he took office. Here is a review of current conditions in those nations. Iraq. Of course, Iraq is currently fighting the Islamic State for control of Mosul and other captured territories. This is creating a flow of both retreating ISIS fighters and refugees from contested areas. ABC News notes that while some Iraqi soldiers fighting in Mosul feel a little bad about Trump's exec order, as one of them put it, others understand his reasoning. "We don't want our doctors and professors to keep going to another country and make it greater than our own," said one Iraqi soldier, who punctuated his comment by exclaiming, "Honestly, I love Trump." Many of the Iraqi refugees have been mistreated by local forces, which could easily make them targets for radicalization. The UK Guardian reported on Sunday that human rights groups are processing complaints about the outright torture of children suspected of connections to the Islamic State, which in turn has an extensive program for radicalizing children and turning them into brainwashed jihadi killers. Shiite militia groups backed by Iran, some of which were murdering U.S. soldiers just a few years ago, are heavily involved in the fighting. There are concerns these emboldened, battle-tested, heavily armed militias will move into Syria and cause a new sectarian crisis. Many of these groups are units of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, for all intents and purposes, and would become shock troops for Syrian dictator Bashar Assad as he finishes off the last elements of the rebellion against him. The Iraqi government, it must be said, does not have the most sterling record for honesty and efficiency. Transparency International recently rated Iraq's government as one of the most corrupt in the entire world. The Iraqi parliament reflexively responded to Trump's executive order with an ill-considered reciprocity ban that will do significant damage to the Iraqi nation if enacted, at the very moment it is fighting a desperate battle to drive out ISIS. That is not the kind of government that can be readily trusted to provide the data needed for enhanced vetting. Iran. Contrary to the fictions peddled by the Obama administration, Iran is still very much an enemy of the United States. Its government is actively involved in subversive efforts across the Middle East and around the world. Even in the last months of the Obama administration, long after Obama's huge economic concessions and cash payments to Tehran, the State Department continues to classify Iran as the world's top state sponsor of terrorism. The State Department remains concerned about a wide range of Iranian activities to destabilize the region. The Iranians are still taking hostages, including U.S. citizens. They put their hostages through sham legal proceedings involving secret courts and lawyers who are not always permitted to speak with their clients. They store their hostages in hideous prisons that would pass inspection in no civilized country. On Sunday, Iran continued its defiance of Barack Obama's nuclear deal with yet another secret test of a banned ballistic missile. Syria. It is astonishing that anyone thinks vetting is possible for many refugees from war-torn Syria, whose sinister central government still does not control many parts of the country. ISIS, of course, is headquartered in Syria, and Al-Qaeda is one of the strongest military forces in the rebellion. Syrian resistance groups are so difficult to screen that the Obama administration could only find tiny handfuls of reliable, moderate fighters who arm and train. They were promptly kidnapped, killed, or co-opted by terrorist groups after Obama deployed them. The White Hat Rebel program ended as a laughingstock across the Middle East. Terrorist groups are still hunting down and destroying moderate rebel units to this very day, even during the ceasefire brokered by Russia, Turkey, and Iran. Worse, Syria has become a pressure cooker for jihad, with groups once regarded as moderate becoming unmistakably radical over the past 5 years. ISIS militants fleeing the battlefields of Iraq have been falling back into Syria, while Syrian ISIS fighters have been fleeing from their own battlefield reversals. The return of Islamic State militants, and other battle-hardened jihadis, from Syria to Western nations has long been seen as a major security concern. The Syrian civil war is universally regarded as one of the worst humanitarian crises in history. Every party to the conflict has been blamed for causing civilian casualties, while some of them deliberately target civilians. The Assad regime has used indiscriminate conventional weapons, and weapons of mass destruction, against rebel-held districts. Civilians have been deprived of food, power, sanitation, and medicine in besieged areas for months, sometimes for years. This will create a huge population that is susceptible to radicalization by terrorists who blame Western powers for either inflicting horror upon civilians, or failing to prevent it. Libya. Due to the U.S. media's poor reporting on the continuing disaster of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton's war in Libya, most Americans probably do not realize Libya still lacks a functioning central government. The brief spate of coverage after the rise of Libyan ISIS ended with reports that a government of national accord had been installed, but in truth it only controls a portion of the country, and some observers believe it is on the verge of collapse. A Gaddafi-era general named Khalifa Haftar is working to seize power, and the Russians have been cozying up to him. The end result of Obama policy in Libya could very well be another Russian client state in the Middle East. Haftar currently controls the government that used to be recognized by the international community as Libya's legitimate administration. That government was chased out of the national capital, Tripoli, by a coalition of Islamist militias, widely known as Libya Dawn. They are still a force to be reckoned with, and constitute the third major Libyan government. ISIS is still a serious problem in Libya, as demonstrated by U.S. air raids against Islamic State positions on President Obama's very last day in office. They have been largely marginalized, but I am hesitant to say they've been completely eliminated in Libya, a U.S. defense official said at the time. Somalia has been fighting a vicious insurgency from an Islamist terror organization called Al-Shabaab, whose name means, the youth. It aggressively recruits young Muslims, including young Somalis living in the United States. The group has links to both Al-Qaeda and ISIS. The primary leadership decided not to swear fealty to the Islamic State, leading to something of a schism between different factions of Al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab is not just a gang of furtive terrorists lurking in the shadows. It effectively controls large portions of rural Somalia, and has been waging war against neighboring Kenya. An attack launched just this weekend killed dozens of Kenyan troops, according to Al-Shabaab claims disputed by the Kenyan government. Al-Shabaab is one of the most savage Islamist terror organizations in the world, responsible for horrific massacres like the slaughter of 150 students at Garissa University College in April 2015, and 67 murdered at the Westgate Shopping Center in the Kenyan capital. An attack on the Daya Hotel in Mogadishu killed 8 people just last week. Al-Shabaab killers are notorious for asking potential victims to prove they are devout Muslims in order to spare their lives. Somalia's government was ranked the most corrupt in the world by Transparency International, in the same study that named Iraq one of the worst. That is not exactly news, because Somalia's government has been listed as the most corrupt on earth for 10 years straight. For the sake of comparison, the number 2 and 3 worst governments on Transparency International's list are South Sudan and North Korea. Somalia's most recent elections were an absurd carnival of bribes and voter intimidation, even with UN oversight. The BBC declared the country has not had a functional national government since the ousting of its former leader Mohammed Shidbar in 1991. Sudan. As mentioned above, the Sudanese government is a corrupt disaster. The country actually split in half in 2011. Over 1.5 million people have been killed in the Sudanese civil war, while 2 million refugees have been displaced from the Darfur region. The president of the Republic of Sudan is an iron-fisted Islamist dictator named Omar Hassan al-Bashir, who has been in power for over 25 years, after seizing power in a 1989 coup that came after 2 decades of civil war. Bashir is wanted for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity by the International Criminal Court. Those charges have been pending since 2009. There are actually 3 counts of genocide against him. He is supposedly under an international travel ban, but he travels anyway, occasionally cutting his trips short when he thinks he might be arrested. The Sudanese government imposed Sharia law on its provinces in the 90s. Bashir has been linked to Janjaweed militias, which serve as his own personal stormtroopers, noted for their scorched-earth tactics and indiscriminate use of mass casualty weapons against civilians. Some observers fear the Janjaweed will eventually ship Bashir's leash and overthrow the government in Khartoum. Sudan is listed as a state sponsor of terrorism and, until recently, it was politically aligned with Iran. Sudan has proven to be friendly terrain for all sorts of gangsters and terrorists, although its political realignment over the past few years reportedly included more cooperation on counterterrorism, in a bid to get off the American list of terrorist sponsors. Even after that realignment, Hamas terrorists seem to have little trouble traveling through Sudan, or raising money there. Yemen is a horrifying bloodbath of civil war and terrorist insurrection, which ties many of the other nations on this list together. Sudan, for example, has been part of Saudi Arabia's coalition in Yemen, ever since it turned away from Iranian patronage. Iran and Saudi Arabia are fighting a proxy war in Yemen, where there have been over 10,000 civilian casualties. The U.S. has been providing weapons to Saudi Arabia, whose coalition is blamed for many of the civilian deaths, so Yemeni resentment of the United States is a very real factor to consider when estimating the dangers of radicalization. The U.S. blocked an arms sale to the Saudis in December 2016 after a Saudi coalition airstrike hit a funeral in the capital of Sana'a, leading to 140 deaths. The Saudi coalition has also been criticized for bombing Doctors Without Borders hospitals. The internationally recognized government of President Abdrabbu Mansur Hadi was displaced by an Iran-backed Shiite insurgency from the Houthi minority, aided by forces loyal to the previous president, Ali Abdullah Saleh. Describing the state of Yemeni government as chaotic would be a vast understatement. Major cities like Sana'a have been subjected to violent takeovers and sieges, while the Yemeni wilderness is largely controlled by al-Qaeda. On Sunday, a U.S. Navy SEAL was killed, and 3 others wounded, in a firefight with al-Qaeda forces in central Yemen. 14 al-Qaeda fighters were reportedly killed, including the brother-in-law of the late al-Qaeda guru, Anwar al-Awlaki. It was the first counter-terrorism operation authorized by President Trump. In October, the U.S. Navy was obliged to strike ground targets in Yemen, after missiles were fired at American ships stationed off the coast.